I showed up at the wedding in a sharply fitted suit, not too ostentatious, but enough to compel respect. Or so I believed. When I entered the air shift, conversations came to a halt for a moment. Then the distinct whispers of judgment began. I had always been viewed as an outsider by my wife's family, but today they weren't even attempting to conceal it. The setting was magnificent. White silk drapes hung from the ceiling chandeliers, shimmering like stars, while extravagant flower arrangements gave the impression that a royal garden had sprung up in the center of the hall. Every element shouted luxury. Every look directed at me shouted something else. Unwanted. As I moved in the direction of my wife's mother, the notorious mother-in-law from hell intercepted me. She was not only the family's matriarch, but also the self-described gatekeeper of prestige and appropriate image. And it seemed that I didn't fit into the one she had in mind. Her face twisted into an overly worried expression, but I knew better. "Oh, dear, you made it," she spoke in an insincere tone. I forced a kind smile as she examined me from head to toe, as though searching for defects. Then, with a condescending air, she pointed to the very back row of seats, reserved for +1s and distant cousins who had shown up despite not being invited. "Why don't you sit over there?" she said, waving dismissively. I blinked, not wanting to ruin the wedding pictures. But their audacity was shocking, so willfully and obviously wicked. Embarrassed, I looked to my wife, half expecting her to stand up for me. Instead, she chuckled softly and shook her head as if I were a harmless idiot. "Mother," she stated politely, but it wasn't a defense. It was a dismissal. I should have gotten used to this by now. I felt like I should just accept my position. My in-laws never concealed their dislike for me. I wasn't wealthy by birth, and I didn't have a last name that denoted anything. I had worked my way up, created something from scratch, and spent my life vacationing in places most people couldn't afford, not by inheritance, but by my own effort. Yet, to them, that wasn't sufficient. So I swallowed my pride, proceeded to the rear, and sat where they requested, observing while the actual family took center stage. Photographers were already taking images of my brother-in-law and his bride. The clinking of pricey cutlery, champagne toasts, and limelight laughter filled the room. But as I looked at my wife, everything faded into the background. She had once said she loved me because of my drive and ambition. She used to claim that money was irrelevant, that we were partners in every aspect. But as time went on, I noticed the change, how she relished the security of being married, down to the point where she allowed her relatives to treat me like a burden rather than her spouse. Today, she didn't just let it happen. Today, she laughed. Something clicked within me. I couldn't sit there and let them act like I didn't exist. I reached inside my pocket, touching the silky surface of my phone, then got up without saying anything and walked outside. They weren't aware yet, but they would never forget this day. The stress melted away from me as I stepped into the refreshing evening air. The arrogant smiles, the contemptuous looks, the whispered laughter, all of it faded as I inhaled deeply. I wasn't upset. I was focused. This wasn't the first time my wife's family had treated me disrespectfully, but today they did it in front of hundreds of guests and cameras, some of whom would remember every instance in which they degraded. Me, believing I would just sit there and take it. That was their first mistake. I took out my phone and navigated to a contact stored under a single word. A voice answered immediately. A grin spread across my lips. "Give me 10 minutes, I said, then laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from a man who enjoys his profession. I hung up without saying anything more. We didn't need to explain. We had planned this occasion months in advance. My wife and her family had always assumed I was struggling because of my modest, low-key lifestyle. They thought I lacked wealth. They never asked about my activities, where my investments were, or the depth of my relationships. That was their second mistake. While they lived their lives showing off their old money and prestige, I had been building something far greater, something with power. And in mere minutes, that power was poised to dismantle everything they had meticulously planned. I took my time walking back inside, my pace tranquil. No rush. My seat at the rear was still there, a symbolic reminder of where they believed I belonged. I tapped softly on the armrest, observing the scene. The groom was grinning as he twirled his bride on the dance floor. Guests sipped their expensive drinks while photographers captured every perfect moment. The band played an elegant melody, filling the hall with harmony. They had no idea what was about to happen. I looked at my wife. She was laughing, sipping champagne, engaged in conversation with her sister and several high society wives. She felt so at ease in my silence. She had assumed I was harmless. That was her third mistake. At the 10-minute mark, I leaned back, adjusting my cufflinks. Then the first clue appeared, subtly, like clockwork. A middle-aged chef in a spotless white uniform approached a server, whispered something, and walked away. Calmly, he removed his apron and left. Then another waiter followed suit. The wedding continued. The guests hadn't noticed yet. Glasses clinked. The music played on. Conversations flowed. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the bartenders, waiters, decorators, and kitchen staff disappeared, one by one. Like ghosts in the night, the entire workforce slipped out the back door. The event my wife's family had spent over a year planning was falling apart, and they didn't even know it yet. But they would. I checked my watch. 5 minutes left. I swirled my drink in my glass, savoring the moment. Cherish this while you can, dear in-laws. You won't like what happens next. I reclined in my chair and watched as the meticulously planned event began to unravel at the edges. Yet, laughter still filled the room. The clinking of champagne glasses continued. Applause burst out sporadically. To the untrained eye, everything appeared flawless, but I could already see the cracks forming beneath the surface. We regret to notify you that this event will now be closed, owing to a breach of contract. Gasps. Whispers. The ceremony was finished, and my mother-in-law stumbled back, stunned into stillness. I simply observed as the chatter, laughter, and glass, clinking, all of it, vanished, leaving behind pale, shocked faces with panic brewing underneath the surface. And standing rigidly in the middle of it all, her immaculately manicured hands trembling at her sides, was her. Throughout the years, she had made fun of me at family get-togethers. I had never seen my mother-in-law this way. Not even when she practically spat at my existence. Not even when she labeled me the poor one behind my back. This was different. For the first time in her life, she was helpless. Despite the pandemonium surrounding her, the venue manager remained steady, her voice even. "Ma'am, I regret to notify you that due to a violation of contract, this event is coming to an end." The words cut through the air like a sword. Guests whispered to one another, clutching their phones, quickly shutting them down, as if that would make the chaos disappear. My mother-in-law blinked twice, her face gradually twisting in rage before she screamed, her voice rising to the point where people turned to stare at her. "What are you talking about?" The manager stood firm. "Your contract makes it clear that any abuse of event personnel is prohibited, verbal, physical, or otherwise. Our employees have filed numerous complaints today, leaving us with no other option." I watched as the words sank in. After years of treading on others as if they were beneath her, she was now at the mercy of those she mistreated. Irony was a beautiful thing. "This is unbelievable." The whispers intensified. "We traveled this far for a wedding, and now there's nothing?" Louder, rougher, more unforgiving, because the wedding was no longer the only thing at stake. This was a matter of reputation. These were socialites, Not just visitors, businessmen and women who thrived on status. Imagine a crumbling event stuck in the fallout. No music, no food, no drinks. A jumble of deserted tables, champagne spills, and the impending embarrassment of attending a wedding that had just collapsed. People were already leaving, one by one, in groups, in pairs, all trying to avoid the shame of being involved in this catastrophe. That's when my mother-in-law's panic turned into desperation. She spun toward my wife, her voice shrill. "Someone, please fix this!" My wife flinched. My father-in-law turned to his wife, hoping he could fix it, but he only shook his head, silently defeated. At that moment, she realized the wedding was over. I had been watching her intently. Watching. As her expression changed from bewilderment to fear. Watching as she put everything together. And when she turned to face me, her hands were shaking. "You did this." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it wasn't a question. It was a fact. I let a slow smile spread across my face, and then in a firm voice, I spoke. "Disrespect has consequences." She inhaled sharply. I gestured toward the destroyed event as the guests ran away. "It's fair, isn't it?" Her eyes widened. "For years you shattered our family. You made me feel inferior. You allowed your family to treat me like trash. And tonight? Tonight you laughed while they mocked me." I shook my head. She was breathing heavily now. Tears welled up in my eyes. But that didn't mean I had to stop. I had swallowed my pride for years. But tonight, I had nothing left to give. I stood up. Then, in a clear, steady voice, I said, "For those of you unfamiliar with me, let me introduce myself." The room fell silent. Guests paused in mid-step. My mother-in-law's face twisted with rage and horror. I turned to the bride and groom. "I'm not the poor one, as you so lovingly refer to me. I am the sole owner of the event staffing company that supplied all of the cuisine, bartenders, decorators, planners, everything for this wedding. And now, they've all left." I stretched my arms out. "They work for me." Gasps echoed. My mother-in-law went pale. My wife looked dazed. "You see," I continued, "while you all laughed at me for years, I was building something." I shook my head, laughed, then I checked my watch. "I think I've seen enough." I turned to my wife and whispered the words that would haunt her forever. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, sweetheart." Then I grinned. "Oh, that's right. There's nothing left to enjoy." I turned and walked away. Slowly, deliberately. Behind me, the silence cracked, a dam bursting into a flood of commotion. "What do you mean he owns the venue?" My mother-in-law's voice turned harsh and desperate. "Get them back! You can't just do this!" But there was no one left to hear her pleas, and when the groom's voice finally cut through the noise, his patience shattered. No staff, no food, no drinks, no music, no wedding, and no reputation. His perfect high-class wedding was burning to ashes, and he knew exactly who was responsible. "You!" Heavy footsteps pounded behind me. A hand clamped down on my shoulder, yanking me back. I turned, slowly, purposefully. The groom snarled, his face inches from mine. "You think this is funny? You think you can just waltz in here and—" His voice cracked. He was shaking, but I just smiled. "Remove your hand." His jaw clenched. He didn't move. He still thought he could intimidate me, but I leaned in just enough for him to hear. "This was never your wedding." His nostrils flared. "Your mother used you as a prop to flaunt her wealth and connections." His face contorted in rage. His hand twitched, ready to strike. That was his last mistake. Before he could move, 2 security guards emerged from the shadows, grabbing his arms. He struggled, but it was useless. I straightened my cufflinks. Then, with a calm, deliberate sigh, I turned toward the exit. A voice stopped me. Not the groom, not my mother-in-law, my wife. Her voice was shaking. Please, don't walk away. I barely turned my head, meeting her devastated gaze. Her lipstick was smudged, her perfect makeup ruined by tears. We can fix this, she whispered. I exhaled. Be reasonable. She took a hesitant step forward. I didn't mean for... I cut her off. You didn't mean to? Her breath hitched. You didn't mean to let them treat me like trash? I gestured at the ruins of the wedding. Sweetheart, you chose them. Her face crumpled. I shrugged. And now? You have to live with that. She reached for me, but I turned my back, and this time, I didn't stop walking. I stepped out into the cool night air, and for the first time in years, I was free.